مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في أوكرانيا ما كان غير وارد أصبح فجأة واقعا مرعبا. الحرب في قلب أوروبا، دمار المدن والمستشفيات والمدارس والملاجئ، ملايين اللاجئين يتدفقون عبر الحدود، ولعل الأمر الأسوأ هو احتمال أن بلدان عضوا في مجلس الأمن التابع للأمم المتحدة قد يستعمل الأسلحة النووية. مدى 77 عاما منذ ألقت الولايات المتحدة قنبلتين ذريتين على اليابان، ما أدى إلى إنهاء الحرب العالمية الثانية بسرعة. منذ ذلك الحين واقع عن هذا السلاح الرهيب لم يستعملوه أي بلد مجددا. هو أحد أعظم إنجازات الدبلوماسية. لقد شهد العالم حربا فظيعة وإبادة شنيعة، لكننا تجنبنا الدمار النووي. نظرا لكون روسيا عاجزة عن تحقيق نصر سريع في أوكرانيا، ألمحت موسكو إلى احتمال استعمال الأسلحة النووية. هل هذا تهديد حقيقي؟ ماذا يعني ذلك بالنسبة إلى أوكرانيا وأوروبا والعالم؟ للنقاش حول ما هو غير وارد يسرني أن أستقبل خبيرتي الطاقة النووية فرانشيسكا جوفانيني وريتشل برونسون. Welcome back to داخل Washington. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, names etched in world history, and names etched that way because we all believe, hope, and act to ensure that a third name will never be added to that list. We're doing this show today because for the first time in recent memory, serious people are talking seriously about the possibility that nuclear weapons may again be used in conflict. Rachel Bronson, Francesca Giovannini, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel Washington to talk about this most serious of topics. So the atom bomb, not used in conflict since the end of World War II. When was the last time we had a close call, a legitimate fear of its use? Rachel?
The time that everybody will remember will be in the early 60s with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's the, I think, when most people would first start. And then those of you in the Middle East who are paying attention to this know that in 72 and 73, nuclear forces were on high alert. So whereas many around the world may go back to the early 60s, I think in the Arab world, you may go back to the early 70s. There's been accidents and near misses throughout the 70s and 80s that often don't make it onto the world stage. But those who pay attention to it know that throughout our recent history, there's been fear that they could be used. And increasingly, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, investments being made that increase the likelihood that they could be used.
So it's really quite remarkable, Francesca, that the world has gone 77 years without another nuclear weapon used in conflict. Was this even imaginable back in 1945 that we would last this long by avoiding another nuclear annihilation?
Certainly not, Robin. As Rachel rightly pointed out, there have been very many explicit nuclear crises, but also many others that we are just discovering right now as declassified information come to the public. We know, for example, that already in 1948, during the very first Berlin blockade, in fact, the Truman administration was, in fact, even contemplating the possibility of using nuclear weapons, the very few arsenal weapons that they had in storage, against the Soviet Union. And then there have been many other occasions. The Eisenhower administration, for example, contemplated the use of nuclear weapons during the Korean War against the Chinese Chinese invasion. So there have been many, many occasions where the world really came very close to the use of another nuclear weapon. And in a way, in our circle, Rachel and I and many other experts said, a big part of why nuclear weapons has not gone off after 1945 has actually to do with luck and not so much with intentionality. There have been a series of coincidences that have actually helped us, but we cannot count on another 75 years without one of these nuclear weapons going off.
So you say luck. Well, people make their own luck. So let's just take a moment before we focus on Ukraine today. How did we really do this? 77 years avoiding the unfathomable. Rachel?
Yeah, maybe it would be useful for the viewers to kind of chunk out the time period that you're talking about. So right after 1945, when they were first used, and 49, when the Soviets exploded their first atomic bomb, there was this rush to try to figure out how to manage this. Do you keep everything secret? The United States try to keep all that information in the United States, hoping that nobody else would find out how to make these things and how to do them. But of course, science spreads, right? So the Soviets then had access to them. And then we had an Atoms for Peace, and we moved nuclear knowledge around the world. And so we were in this active moment of trying to figure out, could we build more than the other side? And we're in this massive arms race, beginning to invest huge amounts of money to try to outdo the US, to outdo the Soviets to outdo the US, France, England, everyone jumping into the game, eventually China, India, as we all know. So the period, though, of kind of that mass rush to try to figure that out and try to just outdo the other side comes to about, you could probably do it 1945 to somewhere around 1970, where after the Cuban Missile Crisis and after a series of near misses, the US and the Soviets, the countries that own and control the most nuclear weapons, start engaging in an effort of arms control. And you do have these confidence building measures, efforts at reduction underway, and a serious international architecture built up to try to prevent against accidents, crises, misperceptions. We saw that in play in 1973 in the Middle East. We saw that throughout the 70s and 80s. And so there's an element of luck, an element of diplomacy and politics that become really important, and a global focus on arms control. Now, we know arms control can't do everything, but as we're moving and there's goodwill towards the serious negotiations, but an effort to never repeat the fears that we saw in the 50s and 60s, there's all this kind of put into place to try to protect us against the unfathomable. What we see at the end of the Cold War, and really in now this 21st century, is this moment where we all look away, right? It's been won. The Cold War is over. We can look up elsewhere. And almost immediately, you start seeing a chipping away of the arms control apparatus. You see new countries coming onto the scene. North Korea, right? We know the focus globally now around Iran. There's no new innovative ideas of how to manage this new situation, India, Pakistan. And then what happens, we have Israel in this mix, right? That we don't talk about, but it's important to talk about. But what happens is in the 21st century, we start moving away from this. The last arms control agreement was between Russia and the US as late as 2010. But in the 21st century, and certainly in the last 10 years, there have been serious investments by every nuclear power that almost ensures that nuclear weapons are more, not less, easier to use. And what we see is a complete collapse of the international arms control architecture. So now there's barely anything that's straddling over the global environment, but certainly the US and Russian environment. There is very little keeping eyes and ears on the ground when it comes to the proliferation and the engagement of nuclear weapons.
This is a pretty frightening global story you're telling, Rachel. Francesca, let's look more specifically at the Russian and the American aspects of this. Every country thinks about nuclear weapons in its own way. How do Russian strategists, Russian leaders think of nuclear weapons? Is it a real possibility in their mindset to employ nuclear weapons, say in the Ukraine conflict?
Robert, I would separate what is the strategic question of the relation between the United States and Russia versus what could be the behavior of Russia within the Ukrainian context. There has been some, I think, confusion about these two very important questions, but they are actually quite distinct questions. When it comes to the relation between the United States and the Russian Federation, the nuclear doctrine of the Russian Federation is very, very clear. The Russians have acknowledged now for a long time that they are in a conventional inferiority vis-a-vis NATO and the United States. The conventional inferiority that you actually see pretty bluntly also in the Ukrainian war.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to explore other angles of the nuclear question, especially in the Ukraine crisis, with Rachel Bronson and Francesca Giovannini in just a moment. The idea that Russia may resort to nuclear weapons in its war against Ukraine is a frightening prospect. But it has been so long since nuclear weapons were a live option that people may want to revisit some of the terrific films that brought this horror to life. My three favorite such films are more psychodrama than graphic portrayals of nuclear devastation. The first is On the Beach, a 1959 film starring Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner, which is the story of how the people of Australia, in the wake of global nuclear war in Europe, come to grips with the knowledge that the radiation cloud is heading their way and will soon kill them all. The second movie is Failsafe, a 1964 film starring Henry Fonda and Walter Matthau. It depicts an American president dealing with a technical malfunction that sends American Air Force bombers to Moscow to deliver a nuclear attack that he cannot stop. And then there is The Day After, a 1983 television movie that is still one of the most watched TV films of all time. Starring Jason Robards, it's the gripping, heart-rending story of how a small Kansas town deals or doesn't deal with the after effects of a nuclear bomb. None of these films makes for fun entertainment, but nuclear war is serious business, and these films take the issue very seriously. Again, my guests today include Rachel Bronson. Rachel is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, where she oversees the management of the famed Doomsday Clock, which monitors how close experts around the world believe the world is to nuclear conflict. Previously, she was a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, a fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center, and an adjunct professor at Columbia University in New York. Also joining us, Francesca Giovannini. She is the executive director of the Project on Managing the Atom at Harvard's Kennedy School Belfer Center. Previously, she served as a senior official of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization at the United Nations in Vienna. All right, let's take a look at a couple of more aspects of this already complicated nuclear angle of the Ukraine conflict. First, Ukraine itself. It used to be a nuclear power with nuclear weapons and then gave them up. What happened there, Francesca?
Well, yes, it is absolutely true. In fact, it was a notable nuclear weapon state. It was the third largest arsenal after the United States and the Soviet Union. And in fact, the majority, I would say, one of the largest contingency of Soviet nuclear weapons were stationed in Ukraine. And that signaled very clearly how important and how strategic Ukraine was in the Soviet era and beyond. And then, there is some dispute on whether, Ukrainians really own these nuclear weapons. In fact, we know that, quite frankly, the ownership remained with the Soviet Union. And so Ukrainians weren't really authorized to keep them in the first place. But let's just say that there were a series of negotiations. And through the Budapest Memorandum in 1995, the Ukrainians seized the control and, in fact, removed the nuclear weapons from their territory and returned them to then the Russian Federation in exchange for very clear economic and security guarantees from both the Russian Federation and the United States. If you read the Budapest Memorandum, is very clear that the Ukrainians have asked and obtained very clear guarantees over their territorial integrity. And one of the lines, a very important line of the Budapest Memorandum, is that the Ukrainian territory will not be subjected to invasion or attack by either the United States and the Russian Federation. The last point I'm going to say is it is noticeable also that Ukraine was the very first country that received nuclear security guarantees from the United States. That was President Clinton, precisely to then convince the Ukrainians to return nuclear weapons to the Russians and then accede to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they returned the nuclear weapons to their creator, which was the Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, but they did so in exchange for very clear and credible guarantees.
So Rachel, when you look at the countries that have given up their nuclear weapons programs, either voluntarily or involuntarily, Iraq, Libya, now Ukraine, and they all eventually get attacked and the first two regimes overthrown. Isn't this a pretty powerful advertisement for getting and keeping nuclear weapons?
Yeah, it's a disaster for arms control. It's a disaster for arms control spending. Everyone around the world knows that the massive investments that go into nuclear weapons just take away from more productive uses in society. We're all sitting in our homes right now, right? Because of this virus that we haven't invested in. We are sinking 21st century dollars into these 20th century weapons that have no productive value. And what we're seeing and the way that Vladimir Putin is brandishing his nuclear weapons, it's a complete disaster. And so that the desperation to try to figure out how do we go back to what I was talking about earlier, or how do we move forward in a multipolar, multi-nuclear state environment to try to reduce the nonsense of money and spending that's keeping the world hostage and is so potentially devastating. If this escalates, we don't want it to, everyone's working to avoid it, but these are humanity-ending weapons at a vast scale.
Rob, can I add a point here,
Sure.
which I really care a lot about? So I love the region. I love the Middle East. I love the Gulf region. I spend a lot of time in the region myself. And many of the countries that are leading the region, including Egypt, have been, often demanding, more progress towards nuclear disarmament, nuclear risk reduction strategies. What this Ukraine crisis war really does is, in my view, really destroy the already feeble trust between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. And the real issue is that even the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty at this point will not be sufficient to guarantee the survival of the many non-nuclear weapon states that have chosen the right path, which is not to weaponize. And so how do we protect their survival at this point when you have nuclear weapon states that go rogue? What is the alternative here? And I suspect that the next review conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty will be a very, very acute confrontation over the complete distrust of what we call the nuclear guardians. And when you have nuclear weapon states that go rogue, what is the alternative for non-nuclear weapon states? We need to think about security guarantees. We need to think about much better protections for these countries moving forward.
All right, Rachel Bronson, Francesca Giovannini, thank you so much for helping to explain this complex and really terrible topic to our viewers across the Middle East. Thank you. I was too young to be in the generation that hid under their school desks in what, in retrospect, was a silly but very serious effort to prevent the terrible radiation effects of nuclear war. That was America in the 1950s. I was born just 9 months before an incident that will forever be seared into the memory of American policymakers. The 13 days of October 1962, when John Fitzgerald Kennedy famously came eyeball to eyeball with the other guy, Nikita Khrushchev. And thankfully for humanity, the Russian blinked. I was captivated by that event, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and needed to learn everything I could about it. I watched every movie, I read every book. I even enjoyed sitting in a booth in the Chinese restaurant in Northwest Washington, down the street from my old house, where an American journalist passed messages back and forth with a Soviet official that helped defuse the most serious threat of nuclear annihilation the world had ever seen. Until now, that is. 77 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 77 years after the world first witnessed the frightening power of an atom unleashed, 77 years of successfully compelling, cajoling, convincing nations to fight terrible wars, but never again to use the most terrible of weapons, that potential has returned. Many of us, me included, had thought this genie was safely tucked inside its bottle, never to reemerge. There were some close calls. Iraq in the 1980s, Syria in the 2000s, North Korea ever since. But thanks to some dexterous diplomacy and some courageous preemptive action, those worst cases have been either averted or contained. But now the genie is out, and the potential culprit is not some small-time, small-country megalomaniac, but the president of a veto-wielding member of the United Nations Security Council, the Russian Federation. I suppose that I suffered from what the 9/11 Commission once called a failure of imagination. I didn't see this coming. With Ukraine remarkably and miraculously repelling the Russian invasion, some smart and well-informed observers have raised the prospect that Vladimir Putin will resort to nuclear weapons to save his reputation, save his control, save even himself. In that case, we may need more of that dexterous diplomacy and perhaps that courageous preemptive action to avoid a calamity of unfathomable proportions. I remain hopeful and confident that this can be achieved, but hope and confidence is not a certainty. What I am certain about is that we have entered a new era in terms of nuclear weapons, not focused on the ones that Russia has, but on the ones that Ukraine gave up. That makes 3 regimes who've been denuclearized, either voluntarily or by force, whose very existence has been subsequently threatened: Saddam's Iraq, Gaddafi's Libya, and now Ukraine. No one cries tears for the demise of Saddam or Gaddafi. Their stories are the opposite of the courageous Democrat who leads the brave United People of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. But the lessons of those 3 countries, lose your nuclear deterrent and open yourself to outside attack, will not be lost on those countries contemplating a nuclear path. It is a sadly compelling logic, and it will ensure that surviving the next 77 years won't be any easier than surviving the last 77. وصلنا إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم أي أسئلة أو تعليقات حول البرنامج، وبالأخص بشأن انتشار الأسلحة النووية والسياسة الخارجية الأمريكية، تواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو تراسلوني مباشرة على الرابط @Rob Satloff. أراكم في الأسبوع القادم. حتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.